Good morning. Today I'm out here on the playa looking for salt to put in my paint to make it stick to the outside of the pot. I've been using clay to stick my mineral paint to the outside of my pot, which works fine. And then I went to the Southwest Kiln Conference in Silver City, and Jeff Cooper kind of threw a wrench into my world. Jeff pointed out that there are naturally available salt fluxes that will cause paints to melt. And that made me think of my experiments with lead-based glazes, because melting minerals onto the pot is actually the best way to make those paints permanent. Then I did a little experiment. I took a bowl and I painted it with iron-based paints, and I used 3 kinds of potential fluxes: table salt, borax, and soda ash. And all 3 of them worked to make that paint melt into the surface of the pot. Now, borax was probably not as commonly available here in prehistoric times, but salt, just ordinary table salt, has been available through people of all times. It was carried on trade routes. It was used in culinary uses. Why couldn't they have used that in a paint? Salt is also available in my area locally in a number of different places, and one of those is here at the Wilcox Playa. Because this is a closed basin, water flows into this basin, but it evaporates out. Salts, over the course of millennia, have accumulated here on the lake bed. So I'm here to collect some of that salt from the lake bed that I can take home and try as a natural flux on my mineral paints. Back in ancient times, there were a couple different ways that people could get salts for their diet. One was natural accumulations of salts, places like the playa or like salt mines. But another common source of salt was in plants that accumulated salt from the soil. Here in the Southwest, native peoples would burn certain kinds of plants and then use those ashes in cooking. Those ashes not only included salts, but also other minerals, so it acted like a baking powder. This method of accumulating minerals from the ashes of certain plants. This is what we today call soda ash. And today it's made in a laboratory, but back in the day, that's what soda ash was. It was soda ash. It came from the ashes of certain plants. Now up north in Hopi and Zuni country, they use the ash of juniper. Down here in the southern Southwest, where juniper wasn't always so available, 4-wing saltbrush is a good alternative. A plant that grows in alkali soils and accumulates those salts. And the ashes of that salt brush may be able to work as a flux in my mineral paint. So I'm gonna collect some of this salt brush here behind me. I'm gonna take it home and I'm gonna burn it, and then we're gonna throw it in some paint and see how it works. So I can hear you now. Andy, you've harvested this crust off the surface of the playa. Sure, it has salt in it, but it has a lot of other junk in it too. How in the world are you going to use this to make pottery paint? Fortunately for us, salt is very water soluble. So I'm going to soak it in water, let it sit for a little bit, mix it up. Hopefully that salt then dissolves, gets in the water, then I can pour the water off and boil it down to get just the salt out of it. Okay, so while that alkali crust is soaking out there in the bucket, let's deal with the salt brush I collected. So this is what I got. It's not a ton, but I think it's plenty for the experiments I'm wanting to run. So I'm going to put this on a baking sheet. I'm going to put it in my oven, and then I'll roast it for a while just to dry it out, because green plants don't burn readily. So I want to get it dry enough that I can just light a match to it and have it burn and create that ash I'm looking for. And by the time this is done, hopefully that stuff out there is done soaking and we can start working on the next stage of processing this. All right, let's talk quickly about how I got to this point. I have been using clay as a fixative in my mineral paint for many, many years. And that is, when you're applying a powdered mineral to the outside of your pot as a paint, it can easily wipe off after firing because there's nothing there to hold it in place. If you add a certain amount of clay to it, then that clay will harden in the fire and hold that pigment on the pot, make it permanent. It is a fixative. I got back from the conference and I went and read Anna Shepard's book, Ceramics for the Archaeologist, specifically the parts that talk about members pottery. And she said that the pigments on there, doing scientific analysis of those paints, was mostly iron oxide with very little clay added. So I'm thinking, how in the world did the members get that clay to stick on the pot so well that after 800, 1,000 years, it's still there today, if they weren't using clay? I have applied red iron oxide to pottery and fired it clear up to like 950 degrees Celsius, and it still wipes off. So I cannot get iron to sinter, that is to melt a little and melt into that clay body, even at the highest of temperatures you can reach in an outdoor firing. So they weren't just using iron alone. There was some other ingredient there causing that iron to melt and attach itself to the body of the pot. So what Jeff was talking about in his presentation was using salt as fluxes. If you're interested in seeing Jeff's presentation, I recorded it and uploaded it to YouTube. I'll put the link to that presentation down in the doobly-doo. I was thinking, if they were using fluxes, what kinds of salt fluxes would be commonly available to people living on the land 800-900 years ago? And I found that salt has a very low melting point. And I thought, wow, I have heard of using salt as a glaze, so I guess that's kind of the same thing. So I did some experiments. I added salt to my iron oxide, and then, because I wanted to try some other things, I added some borax to my iron oxide, and then I also added some soda ash to my iron oxide. All three of these are salt alkali-based fluxes. That is, they melt at fairly low temperatures. So I made this little bowl and I painted it with different sorts of iron oxide. I had limonite, 2 sorts of hematite, and a commercial red iron oxide. And then I applied each of these with one each of the different fluxes, salt, borax, and soda ash. And I fired this just last weekend, and I had some amazing results. Results that made me want to take this to the next step. That is, every one of these melted into the paint. There was no clay added to these paints whatsoever, and they all caused melting of that into the surface. So I've got it to work with commercially available salts. Now I want to try doing it with naturally available salts, just to prove that the ancient people could have done it with what they had available to them. And that's why I went out to the playa today, to collect that alkali crust off the top of the playa and to collect that salt brush. Okay, I don't know if I didn't burn it correctly because it's a lot more charry than it appears ashy. But it tastes very salty. It has a high percentage of salt in it. You could put this on your food and it would actually add a salty flavor to it. So in that way, I think I'm successful. So what I didn't remember from the last time I tried to process Wilcox Playa clay is that something about this clay, it never settles. The sediments in this material will stay suspended indefinitely. So what I imagined was that the sediments would go to the bottom and I could pour off the salty water and then boil that down. This isn't going to work that way. So what I've decided to do is to take some of this suspended sediment, this salty sediment, put it in the pot and boil it down on my stovetop to consolidate it, to make it saltier. But it's also going to be full of sediment. I don't think that's necessarily bad. Okay, I've refined my lake bed sediment, I've burned the salt brush, and I have it soaking in water to kind of make a solution, a salty solution from it. I think I'm all ready to start putting this on this bowl. I have all the minerals and materials here. I'm going to paint on it copper, manganese, iron, and lead. Let me show you how I'm going to mix this paint up. Manganese mixed with soda ash and a little binder. Manganese mixed with lake bed brine and a little binder. Copper carbonate mixed with soda ash. Copper carbonate mixed with lake bed brine. Hematite mixed with soda ash. Hematite mixed with lake bed brine. This is a mixture of lead and copper with soda ash. And this is lead and copper with lake bed brine. And there's my experiment. Iron oxide, copper carbonate, manganese dioxide, and that copper lead mix. Okay, I'm about ready to go. I went ahead and added some controls. I added a few little spots of those same pigments mixed with standard table salt, so I have something to compare it to with my last test bowl. Since this is a different kind of firing, possibly reaching different temperatures, different atmosphere, that way I can, I compare back and forth. I've got a thermocouple set up here so I can monitor the temperature in this firing because I want to know how hot I got it and how long of duration, that kind of thing. So I'm ready to load this up, light that charcoal and let it burn, and we'll see how it does. So the thermocouple had some issues during this firing and never recorded the temperature. All right, it's been a busy day for experimental archaeology here. I left here heading for the Wilcox Playa before 7 o'clock this morning, and now it's almost 7 o'clock at night. And I just recently pulled this out of the fire. So let's look at how the different pigments did and see which one works. First of all, the copper did weird things, and I don't really understand it. But sometimes copper in reduction will get kind of a reddish glow around it. And in this case, it's almost a greenish gray glow, but it's red in places too. If you look really close to the edge, it's red. So these two both had copper in them, and they both did that weird thing. It might have to do with the atmosphere in that little brick charcoal firing, because this, believe it or not, this is my manganese, and it is just as brown as can be. So generally manganese only turns brown when it doesn't oxidize properly. And the only thing that came out kind of the way I expected is the iron. And even then, if you look up here, it's got a weird blush around it. I don't know, the colors are weird. Now that we've established what colors we've got, I'm going to scrub it good and see which of these colors, if any, have stuck. The pigments on this bowl are a mess. And part of it is because of the atmosphere, but more importantly, it's because of my paint recipe. On the lead one here, we can see there's little specks here where it actually melted and went a little bit glazy. So we were achieving our goal in some places here. But overall, the manganese, the iron, and even the copper didn't really melt. On the other hand, if we look at these little control ticks that I put in here up by the rim on all of these were all put in with table salt, whereas these were all put in with more of a liquid type salt from either the lake bed or the salt brush. And so that tells me that there's something wrong with my materials. And I can do better on the atmosphere, but I need to work at refining my materials. Okay, time for round two. I almost finished the video on that sour note of this horrible bowl, but I decided I just can't do that to you guys. I've got to try again before the weather turns completely sour, and it's really close. So I'm kind of in a hurry today. So let me catch you up. This is 2 days later from the last time you saw me. And yesterday I spent most of the day trying to refine those natural salts down to a more concentrated level. I finally got some of the liquid to rise to the top of that lake bed sediment. I was able to pour off a whole pot full of that liquid, and I boiled it down for several hours yesterday, and now I have a small amount of a strange brown brine on the bottom. I'm kind of afraid to taste it because the color is kind of questionable. I don't know if that's maybe the salts in it that are that color or some organic matter. It's a little weird. Here's the other thing I did. I took that ash, that culinary ash that I made from the salt brush, I soaked it in water overnight. The salts that are in it, the fluxes, which is what I'm really after, those are all water soluble. So I soaked it in water overnight and then passed it through a paint strainer so that I got out all the large chunks of grit, ash, and char. Then I put that on the stove and boiled it down to this small amount, maybe a tablespoon or so of this black salty liquid. Okay, so these are both concentrated. Now as a control, I also took some table salt and I put it on the stove and I cooked it down to a brine solution, so a very dense brine solution. So now I have three things I can try on the pot. I have the lake bed crust salt, I have the salt brush ash salt, and I have table salt that I purchased. I have this little pot. I'm gonna throw the paints on these with these three different solutions and get it firing as soon as I can. Let's get started because the bad weather is coming. Okay, I feel a little bit like Han Solo did when he approached the Death Star.
I have a very bad feeling about this.
And the reason I say that is when I pulled my bowl out that I got glazy on, when I first pulled it out, I could see areas where the paint had melted. On this one, it looks flat everywhere, which does not give me hope that it melted. First of all, I oxidized it really good, which is great compared to, what I did over here. So let me go ahead and scrub the paint off of here, and then we'll talk a little bit about whether it stuck and what we can learn from this. Well, this one was more disappointing than the last one. Everything came off. And the little bit of pigment you see here is what naturally just soaks into the porous clay body. Nothing seemed to have melted. The iron, the copper, the manganese all just came off. And the one I made with the copper and lead mixed together, it almost appears to have completely evaporated. I have no idea what was going on there. Literally, this was a complete disaster. And again, I need to point out that I did get iron to melt on this previous bowl. And one of the ingredients here was salt. So I have the right ingredients. I'm just not applying them correctly or something. Now, for some reason, when I recorded this part of the video, none of the audio came through. So I'm doing a voiceover later. And again, I attempted to end the video. And again, I sat around and sulked for a couple days and felt like this wasn't an appropriate ending. And so I had to try again. So let's move forward a couple days and see what that looks like. So this time I was concerned about the salts being drawn away from the paint, being wicked into the dry body of the pot. So I mixed the salts with the organic binder. So here I'm mixing the pigment in, but that binder had already had salts, in this case commercial soda ash, mixed with it in a good concentration. And so the idea is that those organic binders will hold the salts on the place where the paint is to do the most effect. Otherwise, it being water soluble, those salts can be drawn into the body of the pot and lost, or largely lost. So this square in the middle is commercial soda ash mixed with iron oxide and some mesquite binder. And so now I'm going to do the same thing using that lake bed brine. And so this is manganese dioxide. And the mesquite binder that I'm using here has already been mixed up with that lake bed brine. So this is a salty binder. The idea, of course, being that that binder, that organic binder, will hold on to those salts and keep them in place on the paints and not allowing them to be wicked into the body of the pot quite so easily. And then this is copper carbonate mixed up with that lake bed brine organic binder solution. And with this pot, I also applied the same pigments on the outside as I applied on the inside. And this is limonite mixed with lake bed brine. And then this is iron oxide mixed with lake bed brine. And now we're all ready to fire. With this one, I didn't want to fire it with the charcoal. So I went out into the country and fired it in an open environment, hoping that I would get the right atmosphere to melt those paints, given that the original one was fired in this manner. It's easier for me to fire with charcoal in my yard, and possibly even cheaper given the price of gas, because I have to travel about an hour outside of town to get to a place where I can fire like this. Okay, here's my fired bowl. I've literally ended this video twice already. When I did the first firing, I thought that was going to be the end of the video. I recorded an ending. I was getting ready to edit it, and I just thought, this is not the ending I want. Then I made that little pot, and I fired it. And when it didn't come out, I went ahead and filmed an ending to the video. And again, it just kept me up at night. And I thought, doggone it, I'm going to get a positive result. So hopefully, and I haven't tested this yet, hopefully some of this melted. So the frustrating thing to me is that I know I can melt it. I mean, this one here, it went full glaze on me. And the other one's melted a little. I got it to do it once. Let's hope third time's the charm on this, and we can move forward. If not, I'm just going to have to end the video either way and move forward with some more experiments. Okay, not super encouraging results. The inside square with the commercial soda ash did not melt. And I don't think any of the others did either, except perhaps the copper. I think we did okay on the copper, especially where it didn't reduce. But so I don't know. Am I not getting it hot enough? Did I not get this as hot as I got? You know, I don't know. I know I got well over 800 degrees on this, and this one maybe was a little hotter. Certainly not significantly. At least I don't feel like it was significantly hotter. But this one melted good, and this one did not. So I just don't know. Here's the other thing I did different on this bowl. I used those salts in their granular form. I mixed them with the minerals and painted them on fairly quickly, so they didn't have a time to kind of you know, melt down in the liquid and become soluble, right? And become like a solution. Perhaps it works better if those salts are solidified as crystals than mixed in with the liquid. So with this, I tried hard to get the salts to dissolve and then mix those with the organic binder, thinking that that would act better. I may find that those crystals melt easier. And so in the future, I think that's what I'm going to try to do. I don't think temperature-wise there was a huge difference. Atmosphere-wise there wasn't a huge difference. But this was mixed with crystal, and this was mixed with liquid. And so you can see that this one, those colors are much more fast than on this one, where they've mostly wiped away. If anything, hopefully I've taught you something about experimenting with pottery and trying to follow those steps down to figure out how to do something. And so you can also see that there's a lot of trial and error involved in figuring these things out. Fortunately, with my first attempt, I did have some success, because if my first 3 attempts had been these 3 that failed, I'd be ready to give up now. But this shows me it can be done. So I'm going to stay on it, and I'll let you know in a future video how that worked out. Thanks for coming with me today. I'll catch you next time. Hold on, just a minute. I just finished firing this cover sherd, and I want to show you my results. And now on this one, I used crystallized salt instead of dissolving it into a brine, and I got much better results. This has already been scrubbed, and you can see that the iron is sintered in place. It is not coming off. This was iron oxide. This one was limonite with a little copper added to it, and you can see also this one's sintered really good. The copper didn't do as well, but it did much better than copper on previous pots with copper and no fixative. And even the manganese did pretty well. So more work is needed, but I think this is the answer. Crystallized salt instead of a brine. I wanted to show you that before I wrapped up this video.